I want to talk about a short story that I read last year and that really keeps coming back to my mind, and I wanted to discuss it. It's called Tlön, Uqbar, Orbis Tertius. It's in a book called Fictiones, or Fictions. And I think the book's called Fictiones not just because it's a book full of works of fiction, but also because these works discuss what fiction is and what its role is. So it's written by a man called Jorge Luis Borges, who was an Argentinian writer who wrote short stories, poems, and essays. He never wrote a full novel. In the prologue of the Fictiones, he writes, "The composition of vast books is a laborious and impoverishing extravagance. To go on for 500 pages developing an idea whose perfect oral exposition is possible in a few minutes. A better course of procedure is to pretend that these books already exist and then to offer a resume, a commentary." His short stories are incredibly dense. He describes very complex ideas in only 5 to 10 pages. His style is very economical and succinct. I think this short story, Tlön, is probably the longest in the book. It's, I think, 15 pages. So what is the story about? Borges talks about meeting with a friend in a rented house, and his friend cites a passage from an encyclopedia, and they find a copy of this book, a version of this book, in the house they're staying at, and they see that this version of the book doesn't have the passage that his friend cited. They tell some friends about it, some other friends about it, and they all start looking for more copies of this encyclopedia. And his friend finds his own copy, and he finds this passage that he cited, but then they find other copies of the encyclopedia, and there isn't this same passage. The passage is about a country called Uqbar in Asia Minor, which seems like a pretty regular country, but every information about its limits and its geography are self-contained. They don't reference the geography of other countries nearby that could help locate this country. And the interesting thing is that they say the literature in this country never talks about the real world, only the imaginary worlds of Tlön, another world they say. Okay, so they mention this world Tlön, which is an imaginary world that people talk about, that people write about, people from Uqbar write about. And then, okay, they don't find other mentions of Uqbar. They look in libraries all over the world, and they don't find any other reference to Uqbar. And then, about 2 years later, Borges finds a book that was received by a friend of his father's, and the book is called An Encyclopedia of Tlön. So it's an encyclopedia of this made-up world that Uqbar mentioned. This world Tlön is described as working according to Berkeley's idealism. And if you don't know who Berkeley is, Bishop Berkeley, he was a philosopher who didn't really believe in materialism. So he thought the only things that existed were our minds, and the things that we saw were just projections from our minds. His ideas can be summarized by the phrase, "To be is to be perceived." So the things that exist are the things that we perceive. There's a very natural, obvious objection to his ideas, which is that the consequences would be that we could change all the objects that we perceive if we perceive them differently. So he writes of Tlön. Hume noted for all time that Berkeley's arguments neither allowed for the least rebuttal nor produced the slightest conviction. Applied to our earth, such a finding is completely true. In the case of Tlön, it is completely false. Then he says, to the inhabitants of Tlön, the world is not an assemblage of objects in space, but a diverse series of separate acts. In the language of Tlön, there are no nouns, but only impersonal verbs. This is in one part of the planet, and then in another part of the planet, nouns are formed by an accumulation of adjectives. The encyclopedia says that in this planet Tlön, you can essentially make objects from just thinking about them. He writes, centuries and centuries of idealism have continued to influence reality. In the oldest parts of Tlön, lost objects are frequently duplicated. Two people look for a pencil. The first finds it but says nothing. The second finds another pencil, just as real but closer to his expectations. A while after he reads this encyclopedia of Tlön, he finds a handwritten letter that belonged to this friend of his father's. And he finds out through this letter that a secret society had created the idea of Tlön, first of Uqbar and then of Tlön, and they wrote the encyclopedia. After a while, some objects seemingly from Tlön start to appear in reality. And these books, these encyclopedias about Tlön, start to appear in libraries. And people start to believe in Tlön, and they like the idea of idealism, and they want to live in a world that is more similar to Tlön. He says, almost at once, the real world gave way in more than one area. The truth is that it was longing to give away. 10 years ago, any symmetrical scheme with an appearance of order, dialectical materialism, anti-Semitism, Nazism, was enough to hold mankind in thrall. Why not submit to Tlön, to the immense, meticulous evidence of an ordered planet? And then, contact and familiarity with Tlön have brought about the deterioration of our world. Tlön's putative primitive language has now found its way into our schools. The teaching of its harmonious history, so full of stirring episodes, has obliterated the history that presided over my childhood. Numismatics, pharmacology, and archaeology have all been reformed. I understand that biology and mathematics too await their avatars. A far-flung dynasty of isolated individuals has changed the face of the earth. Their task goes on. If our forecasts are not mistaken, 100 years from now, someone will discover the 100 volumes of the second encyclopedia of Tlön. Then English, French, and mere Spanish will disappear from this planet. Our world will be Tlön. So I think a main theme of the story is the difficulty in distinguishing fact from fiction, or imaginary things from material things. And I think this shows up in many different ways. I think mirrors are connected to this. He cites mirrors a lot of times. I think language is related to this, and I think at the end he talks a bit about ideologies, and I think that's connected to this main theme as well. So the really interesting thing is that in his story, an encyclopedia contains a fiction sold as fact. Borges himself is writing fiction in a way that looks like an essay. The whole short story looks like an essay. Looks like he's just writing about his real life. He mentions his real friends, real authors, and then he mixes these things, these real things, with made-up things. So the author Silas Haslam and his book of Labyrinths that Borges mentions, they're not real. If it wasn't for the internet, I would probably have been looking for this book in libraries, like Borges himself was looking for the encyclopedia that mentioned Uqbar in libraries. So I only found out the book isn't real because of the internet. And so the whole story that Borges tells mixes fact and fiction very frequently. And I don't think that's a new thing. I'm reading the Divine Comedy, and Dante does that a lot. He mixes real people from his time and people from history with people from fiction, or demons and angels, and he, at moments in the book, he swears that they're real. But I think what Borges does is somewhat different. Borges mixes fact and fiction in a way that is difficult to distinguish them. The fiction he tells could be real. It's not too far from reality. Not as much as Dante's demons say. He says that the passage about Uqbar is written in a very seemingly official way, and the informations about Uqbar seem very reasonable. Everything seems like it could be real. And in the Encyclopedia of Tlön, there are things that look like they couldn't be real, but then he says that the society which created Tlön then rewrites the encyclopedias before releasing them, and they tone it down. They take out some of the most shocking ideas. They make Tlön look a bit more like our world. And I think that's the tactic that Borges is using in this short story. He's writing in a way that makes us confuse reality with fiction. And in the beginning of the book, in the beginning of the story, he writes about his friend Bioy Casares. We'd lingered over a discussion on the mechanics of writing a novel in the first person, in which the narrator omitted or distorts events, thereby creating discrepancies that would allow a handful of readers, a tiny handful, to come to an appalling or banal realization. And I think he's referring to this very story. So in this story, he omits or distorts events. And I think one of the realizations that we can make is that we can be fooled and think and take fiction as fact. So while it's hard for us to believe that there is a secret society that's written about a whole planet, it's easy for us to believe that, say, Silas Haslam and his book on labyrinths is real. So it's actually easy to make us mistake fiction for fact. And I think this is relevant later on in what I'm going to say. I think one of the things that is very related to this idea of distinguishing fact from fiction is the mirrors that he mentions a lot. He says about mirrors, in the beginning of the story he says, I owe the discovery of Uqbar to the concurrence of a mirror and an encyclopedia. The mirror unsettled the far end of a corridor in a villa in Gaona Street. A bit later in the story he says, from along the corridor the mirror spied on us. We found out, inevitably at such an hour, that there is something unnatural about mirrors. Then Bioy recalled that one of Uqbar's heresiarchs had said that mirrors and copulation are abominable because they multiply the number of men. Further on in the story, when he's talking about the passage about Uqbar, he sees in the encyclopedia the following passage. As a result of religious persecution during the 13th century, Orthodox believers sought refuge on the islands, where their obelisks still stand, and where their stone mirrors are not infrequently unearthed. And then later on, a dim and dwindling memory of Herbert Ashe, an engineer on the Southern Railways, lingers amid the overpowering jasmine and in the illusory depths of the mirrors in the Hotel Androget. He casts mirrors as sort of untrustworthy. I think the interesting thing about mirrors is that they show things that aren't really in there. So they show things that exist, but they show it in their interior. So this illusory depths of the mirrors, I think, refers to the fact that mirrors show things as if they were inside the mirror. So they multiply things. They show things that don't exist. And I think the reason these Orthodox believers, which presumably believed in Tlön, I think the reason they like mirrors is because mirrors show ideal objects. They show things that only exist in our imagination. We only see our impression of things. They're not really there materially. They're just our impressions. I think another theme that relates to the idea of distinguishing fact from fiction is language. When Borges is reading the Encyclopedia of Tlön, he says that among the doctrines of Tlön, none is so deserving of opprobrium as that of materialism. He says there are heresiarchs who propose these ideas, and then a particular heresiarch who proposed the example or the idea of 9 copper coins which are lost and then found in different, and then some of them are found in different days by different people. And then Borges says, since this paradox could not be expressed in the language of Tlön, most people did not understand it. So the language doesn't really have nouns. They don't think of as things as fixed in space or time. And so it's very hard for them to understand this idea of the 9 copper coins being found later on. I know that Borges had a book by Fritz Mauthner, who was a philosopher of language, that he really liked to read and reread again and again. It was called Dictionary of Philosophy, and Fritz Mauthner believed that words don't really represent reality. He said, we use primitive and sensory-based terms to describe abstract thoughts, which inherently distorts truth. And since people can't think independently of language, they can't really arrive at truths. And so Borges is talking about how the language of Tlön is limited in a way and distorts truth. It makes people think about the world in a particular way, and they can't think of a different explanation for reality. There's an interesting short story that Borges wrote. It's called The Analytical Language of John Wilkins. It's also written somewhat like an essay. In it he writes, Descartes also proposed the formation of a similar general language that would organize and contain all of human thought. Around 1664, John Wilkins began to undertake that task. And then he quotes Chesterton, saying, obviously there is no classification of the universe that is not arbitrary and conjectural. So he's suspicious of the possibility of language getting us to truth. And the interesting thing is that he's using language to distort truth in this story as well. So he's showing us how language can do that, can distort reality. Not just in the example of Tlön, but in the example of the short story itself. So I think the way he uses language connects with this idea of distinguishing fact from fiction. And then he mentions mathematics in the short story. In a way, I think that connects to language and to the distinguishing fact from fiction. He writes, Ash in the hotel corridor, holding a book on mathematics. We discussed the duodecimal system. Ash said he was just then transposing duodecimal into sexagesimal tables. And then this guy, Ash, he later on discovers that was somehow related to the society that created Tlön. So he somehow relates mathematics with this society that promoted idealism. And the interesting thing that he mentions duodecimal system and transposing duodecimal into sexagesimal is particularly interesting because these systems are somewhat arbitrary. We usually use the decimal system, which is of base 10. We use the number 10 to count. And that's just probably because we have 10 fingers, and that's how we usually count, using our fingers. But we can use duodecimal, which we use for clocks. It's pretty arbitrary. So in the analytical language of John Wilkins, there's a footnote. Theoretically, the number of systems of numeration is unlimited. The most complex, for the use of divinities and angels, would record an infinite number of symbols, one for each whole number. The simplest requires only two. That would be the binary system, which we use for computers. And Borges also mentions Bertrand Russell, in a footnote in this story, who was a mathematician, a philosopher and a mathematician. And the interesting thing is that Russell was involved in a search to build solid foundations for mathematics. In the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of things about mathematics that weren't very formalized, and mathematicians were very worried about possible contradictions. And some mathematicians started to work on building more solid foundations. A man that was involved in this was Frege, who was trying to build a language to use for logic and mathematics that would be a symbolic language that would be more precise and avoid ambiguities. So I guess he agreed to some extent with these ideas of Mauthner that the language is flawed and can't help us arrive at truth. And so he was looking for this different language. And Russell then came along and pointed out that in this language that Frege created, there was still the possibility for paradoxes, for contradictions. And so Russell himself started to try to build a foundation of math on logic. And in that process, he was trying to build a particular language, but avoiding the paradox that he pointed out in Frege's language. He used a lot of the ideas that Frege had brought, but he wanted to avoid these paradoxes that he had found. And so he wanted to avoid self-reference. And he wrote a huge book proving elementary things of mathematics that was very, very rigorous. And he thought, many people thought, that they had found the sort of perfect way to build mathematics. And then Gödel came along and pointed out that this language that these mathematicians were using was incomplete. So there were truths in this system that they couldn't prove using this system. And so I guess coming back to these ideas of Mauthner that Borges liked, I guess even these languages that aren't built in sensory-based terms, they have a lot of limitations, and they don't necessarily help us arrive at truth, and they can sometimes even distort reality. Borges wrote some interesting things about mathematics in the Spanish version, the Spanish translation of the book Mathematics and Imagination. He says, Russell writes that the vast mathematics are a vast tautology, and to say 3 and 4 is nothing other than a way to say 7. So the idea would be that it's sort of a self-contained language. So Russell's idea was to give certain axioms, certain ideas that we could all agree on, and then from that build everything else in mathematics. And so the truths that we would arrive at later were already contained in those axioms. And then Borges says, like music, maths can dispense with the universe, whose scope they understand and whose occult laws they explore. He writes that an immortal man condemned to life in prison could derive many results from mathematics just in his prison cell without looking at the real world. So in a sense, it's sort of similar to Tlön's literature, which abounds in ideal objects. It's an area that deals with objects that we imagine and not objects that are necessarily there. So there were these, when people were trying to build stronger foundations for mathematics, there were these different groups with different ideas of how to do that. Russell was in a group called the logicists, who were trying to found maths on logic. And then there was this other group called the intuitionists, who thought that mathematics was built by our minds and built by intuition, and that it didn't necessarily talk about the real world. There were these other people called the formalists who also didn't think math was necessarily talking about the real world. So there's this thing in maths where we say there exists a number that does such and such. And these people were thinking about what does it mean when we say that such a number exists? Is it a thing in the real world? Is it just a thing that exists in our minds? And then there are Platonists who think that these mathematical objects are real in a sense. They really exist, and then we just discover them. And in a way that's somewhat similar to idealism. So in a way, I think intuitionism, the view of intuitionism would be somewhat similar to idealism in the sense that to be is to be perceived. So the things that exist in mathematics are the things that exist in our minds, that we perceive. But of course, they're not saying that the world is only built out of these things. And that's, I think, the interesting difference, the important difference. And then I was reading a book called Mathematics, the End of Certainty, and it mentions all these things about the attempt to give foundations for maths. And also, the author is concerned with the path that a lot of mathematicians are taking to a mathematics that is much more abstract, based on just ideas, just imagination, which is somewhat similar to what Borges is saying, I guess, in comparison to mathematicians from old times who were very motivated by real problems from the real world. And the interesting thing is that one of the sub-areas of mathematics that he mentions that he's worried about is topology, which nowadays has a lot of applications actually. And so the interesting thing is that these are ideas, these are objects, ideal objects that we build with our minds, but somehow they really apply to the real world and help us understand the real world. So there's an interesting question of distinguishing imagined things from real material things. And in mathematics, that's somewhat difficult in a way, because you can think of these ideas as just imaginary, but then they apply to the real world. So I think that's an interesting connection with this idea of distinguishing fact from fiction. The last theme that I think the story contains is ideologies and totalitarianism. Close to the end of the story, when things from Tlön start to appear in the real world, and books and anthologies about Tlön start to appear, Borges writes, "Almost at once, the real world gave way in more than one area. The truth is that it was longing to give way. 10 years ago, any symmetrical scheme with an appearance of order, dialectical materialism, anti-Semitism, Nazism, was enough to hold mankind in thrall. Why not submit to Tlön, to the immense, meticulous evidence of an ordered planet?" And the story reminded me a bit of some things I had seen from Hannah Arendt, and then I found this quote from Hannah Arendt from after Borges wrote this story. "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e., the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e., the standards of thought, no longer exist." And I think this is perfect for this story in particular, because the main theme of the story, I think, is the distinction between fact and fiction, and how this relates to idealism and to then ideologies. So Borges mentions some ideologies that were very much in vogue in the time he was writing, and I think the really interesting thing is that the way he talks about these ideas from Tlön is very similar to the way these ideologies actually worked in real life. So he says, "This monism or total idealism invalidates science. From this, it could be inferred that there are no sciences on Tlön, or even reasoning. The paradoxical truth is that there are, and in an almost numberless number." And then later on, when these ideas from Tlön start to take over the world, Borges writes, "Numismatics, pharmacology, and archaeology have all been reformed. I understand that biology and mathematics too await their avatars." And the interesting thing is that in the Nazi regime, many universities started to change what was considered science. So they started to promote some really bizarre and cruel ideas as if they were scientific. So some crazy ideas about race were promoted as if it was real science. So they didn't stop doing science explicitly, but they just changed what they called science. And they reformed the sciences to be more compatible with the ideologies that they professed. And a similar thing happened in the Stalinist regime, where Lysenkoism was very popular, had a lot of power. So if you don't know what Lysenkoism was, Lysenko was a man who didn't really believe in genetics, in the ideas that had a lot of proof behind them and that were promoted by scientists from the West. So he believed that changes that were made to plants of one generation would necessarily carry down to the next generation, which we know isn't true. And so after a while he was put in charge of the agronomy of Russia by Stalin because his ideas were compatible with the ideologies that Stalin defended. And then there was a great famine in Russia because his ideas didn't really work, of course, but he wasn't really blamed for it. And then after some years, his ideas were applied to China's agronomy, and tens of millions of people died from a famine that happened there. And the interesting thing is that a lot of scientists from Russia really disagreed with Lysenko, but they were often silenced. They were really persecuted. There was one scientist who spoke against him who was imprisoned. I think they invented some charges of treason, and they arrested him and he died in prison. And so the way Borges talks about science in Tlön, I think, is really fitting of what happens when ideologies take over countries. And I think it's very interesting that he's saying, in a way, maybe, that these ideologies are very similar to idealism in the sense that they believe they can mold the world. So in Lysenkoism, he wasn't really concerned with evidence. He thought somehow he could change the way things really work. Apparently, some studies that have been done on his work show that he probably knew that what he was saying wasn't true. Apparently, he falsified some data, and so maybe he was hoping that somehow he could change how the world actually works. And a lot of people around him were hoping they could do that. And in Nazism, something very similar happens. They wanted to make a world that was, in their view, perfectly ordered. So it's very interesting how Borges compares idealism, where materiality doesn't really stop us, where materiality doesn't really have a place, with these ideologies that seem to want to completely change the world. And the really interesting thing as well is that in both of these cases, in Nazi Germany and in Stalinist Russia, people who were against the reigning ideologies were often silenced and persecuted. So there's this notion that you have to stop people from perceiving and then speaking about the world in a particular way, because when people speak in a way that doesn't conform to your ideology, that can directly affect the world. So they give words a lot of importance, and they try to control people's words and even people's thoughts, which I think relates very interestingly to idealism, in the sense that they give the thoughts of people so much importance in the way that it interferes with the world. Of course, the way we think about the world has an effect on how the world works. We can, in a way, change things about the world, and the way we think about the world affects what actions we take and how we change the world around us, but to some extent. And they give thoughts an immense amount of power, and they try to control people's thoughts. Another interesting part of Borges' story, he writes, "The systematic manufacture of Hrungnir, according to volume 11, has given great scope to archaeologists, allowing them to question and even change the past, which is now as pliant and manageable as the future." And then he writes, "The teaching of its harmonious history, so full of stirring episodes, has obliterated the history that presided over my childhood. which also happened in the case in Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. Stalin would often erase people from photos with him, people who were no longer allied with him, and a lot of historians who were aligned with the ideas of Nazism tried to change history to say that some countries were in fact areas under Germany, so they had a right to conquer these countries and take them back. And so the way he talks about the way idealism takes over the world reminds me a lot of these ideologies, and I think he's making a very interesting parallel. And I think this story and Hannah Arendt's quote, of course, point to the fact that distinguishing fact from fiction is one of the ways that we have of not submitting to totalitarian ideas. So people get mesmerized by the planet's order and discipline, and they start to adopt these ideas. It doesn't really matter to them whether it's a real planet or not, whether these ideas work in our reality or not. They just start to adopt these ideas because they're pretty, because they explain reality in a very simple way. Hannah Arendt also said, thus totalitarianism is based on a secular pseudoscientific ideology that reduces the complexity of reality to the logic of one idea pretending to be able to explain everything. And so trying to accept these ideas that really simplify the world is very attractive, and distinguishing fact from fiction is very important to keep us from accepting ideas that might be somehow pretty or ordered, but don't necessarily represent the world, the real world. And I think today it's actually very hard sometimes to tell fact from fiction or true from false because of parts of the internet and, say, AI making videos, some of them quite realistic, or changing photos. It's very bizarre to see some of the things that can be, some of the photos that have been doctored. They look very realistic. And so we're perhaps in a more delicate time where we might be somewhat vulnerable to these ideas that are similar to idealism. And when I read this story, it reminded me of some ideas that we have right now that I think are very similar to idealism in some senses. The idea, for instance, of that if we change a word that refers to an oppressed group, say, that somehow we are ameliorating the circumstances of that group. So Steven Pinker talks about the euphemism treadmill. He gives the example of the word slum turning into the word ghetto, turning into the word inner city. So the interesting thing is that the living conditions of the people living there hasn't changed, but the word we use to refer to the place has changed. So there's a really big concern about using the right word, and usually a new word that's proposed. The way he says it works is something has taken a bad connotation, and then people change the word to refer to that group of people. And then, of course, the new word takes on the bad connotation, and then we have to change the word again. So the idea of changing the word and forcing people to use the new word is very odd to me. It seems close to idealism in the sense that you give so much importance to the way things are perceived and talked about, and not so much thought about the material reality. So changing the material reality of people who live in very poor places would be much more useful than controlling the word that people use to refer to those places. Because if the conditions of the people living there, the conditions don't change, then the new word is just going to take on a bad connotation as well. So it seems to me like an inverted thinking, a thinking that is similar to idealism, in the sense that it takes the way the object is perceived to change the object. So if we change the word, if we change the way the object is talked about, somehow we change the object itself. And these ideas that the way we perceive things affect them sort of directly seems to have become a full-on ideology that is, to me, very similar to what Borges describes in the story. He talks about the fact there are many sciences in Tlön, and that our sciences are being reformed by the new ideas from Tlön. And these ideas from now have affected science as well, and have been sort of reforming science and creating new sciences, quote-unquote sciences, in an interesting way. So there's a book called The War on Science, which is a book by, I think, 39 academics that have been talking about these ideas of forcing people to change the word they use to refer to things. And in the book he says, various academic journals now advise their editors to not accept papers that might cause offense, regardless of their validity or potential importance. And then he says that in 2018 to 2019, for example, the Life Sciences Department at Berkeley reported that 76% of applicants were rejected based on their diversity statements without looking at their research records. So it's not that diversity is bad, it's just the way they want to do diversity policies is related to this idea of just changing words, just forcing people to change certain words. And so the way they hire certain scientists now is according to whether they agree with these particular ideas or not. And the really interesting thing is that this book, The War on Science, I have only read the introduction and then the first guest chapter. I haven't read the whole thing. And the first guest chapter is from Richard Dawkins, and the really interesting thing is that he mentions idealism and Lysenkoism as related to these new ideas. So I think these things really are very linked together. A lot of critics said of Borges that he never talked really about the real world, that he was always talking about fantastical ideas, and he was apolitical. But I think this story is a bit political, actually. It does talk about the real world. It was talking quite explicitly about ideologies from Borges' time. And I think something that makes the story very strong, very more powerful perhaps than other stories that are very political, is that because it doesn't talk about particular policies and particular actions, it talks about the fundamental underlying ideas of these ideologies. It can apply to a very wide range of bad ideas. So say these new ideas can fit very well with this story. And so I think the very powerful thing in Borges' writing is that it's very abstract, and it goes down to the root of ideas. And so the scope of his stories, the themes that can fit with the story, are really varied, and the story can maintain its relevance for very long. I think the abstract way Borges talks about things is really, really great. And I think a lot of critics didn't really notice this about him. So I'm sure there's stuff that I didn't say that maybe you noticed in the story. And I'd love to know if you think something, if you've seen something different in the story, or if you disagree with me. I'd really love to just really discuss the story.